Hi Year 8. For this week's homework, we are going to practice how to write an effective OETW paragraph. For today's homework, you're going to need a piece of paper, a pen, and the ability to listen to audio. And the reason I've set this homework this week is because in about 2 weeks' time, you will have your first assessment for History of Rhetoric. And in that assessment, you will have to write an extended piece of language analysis for a non-fiction text, and that text will be a speech. So the skills that we're going to practice and look at in this homework will help us with that. If you need to now, take a moment to pause this video and get anything that you need. But otherwise, let's get started. So today's homework will give you some tips and tricks to help you score highly in your English language assessment. And it is also going to give you an opportunity to practice your analysis skills before the assessment as well. So we're going to look at this speech today for our example. This is a speech by a man called General Douglas MacArthur. And my first tip to you, whenever you're looking at a speech, is to think about the context of the text that you are reading. So when you are doing your lessons in the run-up to your assessment, your teacher will tell you a little bit of context about the text that you're going to be reading. Really think about that, because this will help you to better understand the text and the intended audience and purpose. As you can probably gather from this picture, General Douglas MacArthur was a soldier, and in this speech he's actually talking to some new recruits to the army. So he's really trying to inspire them in this speech to be good soldiers and to be effective soldiers for the American military. He was an American soldier. So that's something that we really want to think about when we are analysing this speech. So before we move on, let's read through this speech together. Duty, honour, country. Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. They are your rallying point to build courage when courage seems to fail, to regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith, to create hope when hope becomes forlorn. So we know from the context that he's trying to inspire troops. The thing that we want to do is we want to look for some juicy quotes. And by a juicy quote, I mean a quote that has plenty of interesting language devices and words that have very strong connotations. So we're looking for quotes that we feel that we could say a lot about. So reading through this speech, I've picked out 3 quotes I think are juicy quotes. The first one is the first 2 lines. Duty, honour, country. Those 3 hallowed words. I'm going to talk about this quote in a bit more detail in a moment, but I think this quote is really interesting because I can see straight away there is a triple in duty, honour and country, and I also think that word hallowed is quite interesting as well, so we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. I also have spotted the quote, you ought to be, what you can be and what you will be. And I can see there that we've got the use of repetition, we've got the use of another triple, and we've got a really interesting selection of verbs as well. We've got 3 modal verbs. What you ought to be, so the word ought just means should. So what you should be, what you can be, and what you will be. And actually I can tell that those verbs, they're actually getting stronger as they go. So that's something that I could talk about. And the third thing that I think is quite an interesting quote, quite a juicy quote, is this one. To regain faith when there seems to be little cause for faith. So I can see there that we've got the use of contrast. We've got regaining faith when there is little cause for faith. So we've got 2 contrasting ideas there. And I also think we've got an interesting word with the word faith as well. I can think of lots of connotations in terms of religion possibly and God that we could make for that word. So let's have a look at that first quote in a little bit more detail together. My third tip to you and my final tip for today is when you are analysing quotes, you want to try and zoom in on as many different words as you can. Now, your teacher will have talked to you about zooming in on different words, but what I particularly want you to think about is to think about why the writer might have chosen those words instead of another. So let's have a look again at that first quote that I picked out, the first juicy quote. Duty, honour, country. Those three hallowed words. What are some of the things that I could zoom in on in this quote? Well, the first thing, of course, is that triple. We've got three words there that have been really carefully chosen: duty, honour, and country. So what could I say about those? Well, obviously it's a triple. It's a list of three nouns. But I could also zoom in on each of those words and think about some of the connotations or the ideas that are suggested. So duty connotes a sense of obligation. You're being obliged to do something. You have to do something. Because duty is something that must be done. It's like a job. I could also think about the connotations of honour. That connotes a sense of morality or doing the right thing. And I can think about different kinds of honour as well. Particularly men seem to think that honour is a very admirable thing, to be honourable, and particularly soldiers. So when I'm thinking about the context, honour is very important for soldiers and men. So that's something I might want to think about in my answer. And finally, country. The notion of a country to a soldier is going to connote a sense of patriotism, which is a sense of national pride, being proud of where you come from. And this is going to be really important in times of war, because to be proud of your country is going to encourage people to be courageous and to fight. So there's lots that I could talk about there. I could also, if I choose to, I could talk about the word hallowed as well. I think that's quite an interesting word, because hallowed is a verb that means sacred or revered or made holy. So I can think there about some of perhaps the religious connotations. Perhaps this implies that what he's saying needs to be taken very seriously, like people would take religion. And remember that the majority of America is a Christian country and is religious. So that's something that perhaps he's trying to play on there, is the idea that it's morally right and also sacred in the eyes of God. So there's lots that we could talk about there. What I'm going to do now is we're going to have a look at how we would actually write that in a paragraph. So here's an example question. How has MacArthur used language to persuade in his speech? And we can see we're going to use the OET-WE structure that we're really familiar with now in English language. We're going to make a strong opening point for our first paragraph. We're going to give some evidence in the form of a quote. Then we're going to think about the technique or techniques that are used. We're going to think about why the writer has used the techniques and what the effect is. And remember, the why and the effect part, that's the really important part in your paragraph, because that's the analysis. When we're looking at the deeper meaning of words, when we're looking at the deeper meaning of language that's used, why the writer has used it and what the effect is, that is really where we're explaining and analysing the language in detail. And that's where we're going to pick up the majority of our marks. So let's have a look at my paragraph. My strong opening point is going to be that MacArthur uses a range of language devices to persuade. But I'm going to make that a little bit stronger by explaining exactly what he's persuading his audience to do. And his audience is being persuaded to be strong and courageous. So I'm being really specific there with what the audience is being persuaded to do. I'm then going to give my example. So nice and simple, we give a quote. And then I'm going to say what technique has been used. And of course, as we said before, it's a triple of three powerful nouns. We've got duty, honour and country. So quite straightforward so far, but as I said, why the writer has used the technique or the words and what they do, that's the really important part. So we want this part to be as detailed as possible. To get the highest grades, we want to be zooming in on key words here. So why has the writer used this triple? The use of the triple makes the phrase memorable for the listeners, and this is important because MacArthur wants his audience to remember his message. So far, so good. Now I'm going to zoom into my words. So, Each of the nouns have been chosen to persuade the soldiers to be brave when fighting for their country. Duty implies a sense of obligation, as we said. The listeners must be brave as that is their job to be so. The noun honour has been chosen because it implies that being brave is morally the right thing to do. And in addition, the noun country has been used to make the audience feel patriotic towards their country, something which is particularly important in wartime. Now you can see that this section is much more detailed than my previous sections, and so it should be for you. Don't worry too much if you struggle to zoom into more than one word. If you're zooming into one word and you're explaining that really well, that is enough to get a reasonably good mark. But what I just wanted to show you here is just how far you can take that analysis. You can really think about each of the words in detail and really try to explore those connotations to get a really high level. But even exploring the connotations of one or two words will help you to pick up some higher marks. Okay, so I've talked about why MacArthur has chosen those words in particular and what some of the connotations may be. I now need to talk about the effect. So, what is the effect on the reader, or in this case the audience or the listeners? This would make the listeners feel compelled to be courageous in the face of danger, because they would feel that it is expected of them and that they would be judged as immoral or dishonourable if they didn't stand up and fight. Additionally, they would feel an urge to protect their country due to the feelings of patriotism evoked by MacArthur, despite the significant risks and dangers ahead in their military careers. In this way, MacArthur effectively inspires his listeners to be brave in the face of adversity. So notice again, I'm being really detailed here. I'm using the word because to develop my explanation, to demonstrate that I really understand the effect. And this should be one of the most detailed parts of my analysis. So when you're writing your ETW paragraphs, make sure that your why used and the effect section of your paragraph is as detailed as possible. Okay, now that we've watched the video, I'd like you to go back to class charts and you need to complete your homework task. That has been uploaded for you as a PowerPoint. As usual, there is a mild task that everybody needs to complete and a hot task for those of you who want an extra challenge. Good luck, Year 8.